Professor Bill Piston is here, and we're pleased to have this as the latest publication of the Ozark Studies Institute. So a few years ago, the Ozark Studies Institute has been around for decades, but a few years ago, due to some retirements, it came over to the library, and we've got Ozarks Watch magazine on a twice-a-year publication schedule. It's doing very well, and we started a monographic series. This is the fourth publication with more in the pipeline, so stay tuned for more things coming from the Ozark Studies Institute. If this is your first visit to the Ozarks Room, feel free to browse, and it's a work in progress, but we're very happy to have it open, and it's now become a place-based manifestation of all the things that we do with the Ozark Studies Institute. And teaser alert, next month there's going to be a big announcement about a big new initiative involving the Ozark Studies Institute. But I can't talk about it today, unfortunately, in detail, but we'll be announcing it next month. Really excited about that. So before I turn it over to Dr. Piston, Professor Piston, I want to another thing we do at the Ozark Studies Institute are called oral histories. And so we interview people, and one of our series we call Ozarks Voices. Just last evening, I was down in Little McClure in Northeast Taney County, interviewing a retired high school teacher, 90 years old, lovely person. And in the course of that interview, she mentioned that at one point she had to teach Civil War history, which was not her area of expertise at all, but it was a small high school. And she goes, there is a vast amount of literature about the Civil War. And I said, I know. And it's an industry unto itself. It's a publishing industry unto itself. Having said that, though, my sense of the literature about the Civil War is that what's called the Trans-Mississippi West is sort of under-examined, I would say, in the overall literature of the American Civil War. And so we're very pleased to offer this particular publication because I think it'll be a major addition to the literature of the Trans-Mississippi West Civil War. So without further ado, I've been asked to say, Professor Piston will speak for a few minutes about the book. Then we'll have some time for Q&A. I should shout out to the Facebook attendees, not Facebook, Zoom attendees, welcome. And you also have a chance to make questions or comments. And we'll try to address as many as we can during the roughly hour that we have together. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Bill Piston.
It's a pleasure to be here. And it's also, John and I take pleasure in saying how grateful we are to be allowed to participate in the Ozark Studies Institute's publications. We are very grateful for that. This is my first time in the Ozark Studies room, and I found it interesting that you described it as a work in progress, because if you come to my house, the things that are work in progress don't look like this. The plan, as I understood, was for John and I to talk about writing the book, not to give you a summary of the book. And I need to begin by saying this book exists because of Professor Steve McIntyre in the Department of History, who had the idea now many years ago that it would be nice to put out a book on the history of the city of Springfield, and that could be done drawing upon members of the faculty there, his colleagues in the Department of History, and a few other people from outside. And after several permutations, that came into existence as a book called Springfield Urban Histories. And that got published through Moon City Press. And we're very fortunate to have the editor of that, Jim Baumlin, with us here. So also this book exists thanks to Jim Baumlin. Steve said, can you write something on the Civil War? And I said, well, I keep thinking about something on the Battle of Springfield, and I know a friend of mine, former student John Rutherford, has been doing some work on that. We'll see if we can do an article on that. And we did. Found it hard to keep it to 60 pages and realized that we could have gone much longer. And so when then A little while later, Jim Bomlin said, you guys should really expand this into a book. The Battle of Springfield is one part of something larger, Marmaduke's Raid, and encouraged us to do so. And over more time than I would care to admit, we worked on that, and with the very kind support and great patience of Tom and Jim, it became a book. So that is why it is here. But why Marmaduke's Raid? Why a raid? A Confederate general named John Sappington Marmaduke leading a raid up from Arkansas, coming up north into Springfield, fighting a battle in Springfield itself on January 8th, 1863, moving east, fighting a battle at Hartville, Missouri on the 11th of January, 1863, and then skedaddling back to Arkansas. What makes this worth studying? Well, one reason is it raises the fascinating question of how was a former mayor of Toledo, Ohio, able to defeat in battle a West Point graduate? So we thought that was worth investigating. The former mayor of Toledo, Ohio was Egbert Benson Brown, who was one of those political generals of the Civil War, and was actually the commander here in Springfield when very unexpectedly he found raiders on his front step. Honestly, in looking at that, John and I are still not sure to what degree it was natural talent or luck. And so, as you might imagine, we come down to saying it was a little bit of both. Certainly for someone who had never commanded in battle and had just been an administrator, he was unflappable and did a good job of shifting troops back and forth, and always seemed to be able to get someone where the crisis was. So we credit him with doing a fine job. As for Marmaduke, tremendous mystery. The report that Marmaduke wrote of the raid does not give a lot of information. The report his subordinates wrote gave a lot more information, and yet one of the things that's very difficult to determine is what decisions were made by Marmaduke and what decisions were made by his subordinates. And it does appear that at both the battles, not the raid, but the battles, that Marmaduke virtually turned over control of the battle to his talented subordinate, Joseph Orville, Joe Shelby, who's generally acknowledged to be then rising to becoming the most talented cavalry commander west of the Mississippi River. So there's another thing where we gave credit to Joe Shelby, but have to admit that the sources simply don't allow us to say what we'd like to say. But it does appear. Someone a long time ago told me they read something that Marmaduke had poor eyesight. I said, "Where's your source for that?" So I have no idea. But certainly Joe Shelby fought tactically and did very well. They attacked Springfield thinking it was going to be very weakly garrisoned. But Brown had about 2,000 men. The raiders only had about 1,900, and to attack a target, you usually want to have an advantage of 3 to 1. So under the circumstances, Joe Shelby fought well. But again, back to researching, I want to just give you an idea briefly of what was involved in some of this. How do you find information about this? Many of you know, I hope my former students know, that there is a series of books published by the federal government beginning the 1880s through the early part of the 20th century, a long title, The War of the Rebellion, compilation of the official records of the Union Confederate armies, 128 volumes, publishing only a small portion of the records that the Civil War produced, including captured Confederate records. That's where every Civil War historian starts, is to see what we would call today after-action reports. Written with various degrees of quality, and at various times after the event, they are always someone recalling something that occurred. Civil War armies did not have what you have today, someone whose assignment within the staff of the commanding officer to keep track of what's going on and to keep track of what orders were given and when. That simply didn't exist at that time. But that has been a major source. What can you do to supplement that? Well, of course, there are archives. There are wonderful archives like here. There are wonderful archives like in Jeff City, Columbia, St. Louis, Kansas City, and we took advantage of those. I did a significant amount of that research. And it's always fun to travel and get the benefit of incredibly professional staffs that make all of that possible. Another thing you can do is look at newspapers. More of them are online, but you can order things on microfilm often. But what newspapers? Unfortunately, no Civil War newspapers from Springfield from the period of the raid exist. No. Well, you can go to surrounding towns and see if they mention it, and that's fine. But another thing you can do, if you're a very good researcher, you can look at the units that participated. Let's take the 3rd Iowa Cavalry, which fought at Hartville, not at Springfield. Documents exist. You can look up and find out where the different people in this regiment enlisted, raised in 10 separate companies. There are reference books printed since the Civil War. You can find out who commanded what company and where they were raised. Right? Then if you now have a list of towns where those soldiers came from, you can see if any of those towns produce newspapers. And then, well, boy, let's get the newspapers covering the period right after the raid and hope those soldiers wrote some stuff home. And occasionally you can strike gold that way. But then if you're an incredibly diligent researcher, you can go, Americans love 5s and 0s. They just adore them. Well, you might also know that the big period of commemoration of the Civil War came in the 1880s, 20 years after the war. A lot of forgive and forget, leaving African Americans out of all of this, but that's another story. A lot of forgive and forget. Emphasis on reunions and joint reunions. A lot of newspapers began publishing articles about what the people from our hometown did. So you look in the 1880s, and then you can just look 5s and 0s, get a city's newspaper, see if there's anything on there, realizing also that as the century turns and the generation is dying off, often you get articles. So a great deal of hunting, finding a newspaper, and then literally just going to a date, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, looking at a newspaper for that, obviously the anniversary date, but realizing, newspapers, you want to check a little before and a little after the anniversary dates. You've got a lot of newspapers to go through. And these are 19th century newspapers. They're not remotely organized like newspapers today. They don't have an entertainment section. They don't have a news section. They don't have one section you can go to where this is going to be. Not only that, all of the newspapers have a different format. From one town, Davenport's newspaper, we formatted different from Dubuque. Fortunately, if you look for a lot of them, you'll find out where in this particular paper, Dubuque, this is where they tended to publish this sort of thing. So you start doing that for as many newspapers as you can find for soldiers who their company was raised in that town. And John Rutherford did just an unbelievable amount of research doing that sort of thing. I did some of it in other projects I've done before this book. I've done a lot of it, but John Rutherford deserves credit for finding an incredible amount of information through just going and hunting on the idea, well, they might have produced something there. So a lot of the detail that brings this book to life certainly owes it to John and his research. So I want to make sure he gets credit. Another reason for writing this book is, well, previous works on it. There are a few, but they weren't very detailed. It did not go into a lot of depth. And so we thought it was worthwhile doing. But honestly, to educate ourselves. I lived in Missouri 30 plus years, taught 29 years. I was still teaching when we started this project. The battle took place literally here on campus. It skirted Strong Hall, not where we are here, but across Strong Hall. So where I used to lecture, I tell my students you're on top of the battlefield, and some scattered movements over on Delaware and stuff, including coming down the street where I live. But we're here on this battlefield, and I really don't know about it what I should. And so to educate ourselves, for both of us, we thought this was something we should know more of. Believing that local history is important. And as you may or may not know, John Rutherford is an associate at the library for the local history department there. So local history has been his forte, and he's a fine scholar of Springfield history throughout Springfield history, not just the Civil War. So we wanted to educate ourselves. The big disappointment in writing this book was how few sources we found that went beyond the military. How few sources we found that gave us the ability to discuss what the civilians in the area thought, the civilians of Springfield, the civilians of Hartville, what the perspective was like for the women who were living here, what it was like for the perspective of the women who remained back in Arkansas and saw the soldiers leave to go up to Arkansas and then come back and wondering if their loved ones had been left dead or wounded on the battlefield. So looking for those sorts of things, we did not find nearly as much as we would like, and almost nothing about African Americans, nothing that gave us what would be called their voice, nothing where they spoke for themselves. Some references that let us find that African American labor was used, both free and slave labor, in building entrenchments, earth fortifications that were here in Springfield. So sadly, not much of that. Actually, thanks in part to a good friend of ours, Jeff Patrick, former historian, now a curator of the collection at the Wilson's Creek National Battlefield. Jeff found an incredible letter from a woman who did watch the battle from the balcony of a house about half a mile from the battlefield in the home of Charles Shepard. Some of you know the Shepard family is a very distinguished family in Springfield history. And she wrote a letter that was published in the newspaper back in Virginia, which is where she had gone home to. And she did discuss what it was like to watch the battle, and that the Shepard home had become a refuge for many women and children, and talked about the anxiety of the women. And as the guns would go off, the women would not know, is that the cannonball that took off my husband's head? Is that the shot I just heard? And so she conveyed that anxiety, and we were able to get that in there. But how much, so we would have loved to have found more of that. So for the criticisms we're bound to get from reviewers, you didn't speak enough about women and African Americans, you're right. But it is not because we didn't try, not because we didn't try. I don't know how mine, 20 after you had in mind?
Oh, bottom of the hour.
Yeah,
So,
okay. One of the, for me, interesting parts of this and challenges of this is writing in partnership, researching in partnership. Some of you may have done that. I had done that before this. So I took this project on with some idea of what it would be like, but that does take some special organization. It's not terribly difficult to divide the research. If you have gotten together and have a good idea of what you envision as the book, an outline of what you're going to do, you know what sorts of materials you're looking for, then if it's my job to go to Jefferson City while John is reading newspapers on microfilm, it's not terribly difficult. And if you've both done writing and research before, you can trust your partner to know what he's doing. When it comes to writing, however, that is a challenge. And I benefited years ago from a friend of mine, a historian named Herman Hattaway. He's actually retired and living in Kansas City, very distinguishable historian, who had written more than one project in partnership. And he learned this was years ago, writing a project in partnership. And he said, listen, I don't know what you had in mind, but what you need to do is divide up the chapters. Just divide up the chapters and write a chapter on your own. Don't try and do individual chapters and write them together. And then we both write chapter 2. Just don't do that. Write individual, then swap them. And so I had done that on a previous project, working about the Battle of Wilson's Creek. That seemed to work very fine between myself and my partner, Rick Hatcher, who in those days he was living in South Carolina, mailing discs back and forth to each other because there wasn't an internet by which we could download these things. So we had to, can you imagine? Can you imagine what that was like? So obviously working with the internet and things, and of course, John living here in town, that made that much easier. And so we wrote individual chapters and then went over each other's work. And I always found that whenever John quoted something, his quotation was far too long. He didn't really get to the essence of it. He could really cut out about half of it. And John found whenever he got to one of my quotations that it was always much too long and I could get rid of a half of it. So there's a benefit, because there is there is a temptation, particularly when you found something that you like, to include all of it. all of it, not just what fits, but all of it. And so when you're working with a partner, then before it gets to an editor who's going to write your quotations are too long, yeah, save that editor some of that work. They'll still make some comments about that, but that's one of the benefits of working in partnership. And of course, it's easy to see someone else being wordy, too wordy, and overlook it yourself. So we benefited from each other's criticisms, and I think in many ways that made it a better book. We did learn more than once, the perils of cutting and pasting, as we would decide what to do and how to rearrange things. And John would say, this is good, but it really needs to be down there. And I'd tell John, move this section to here. And computers make this all possible, but it's very easy to get confused and stuff, and then straightening out your footnotes and things. So there are times, even up to the last, we found some glitches, why does that say the same thing here? It says here. Oh, so there's that peril, but that pales compared to the idea of the old days when the first book I wrote, every first chapter was written out longhand because the Carrolls in the library where I was a graduate student didn't lock, so you couldn't leave a typewriter there. So I actually know what it's like to write a book, at least the first chapter, longhand. I am remiss and meant to do this at the top, and I don't feel bad about this. That one of the just beyond words benefits we had is to have the services of Jim Coombs to work on our maps. He had done so with the Springfield's Urban Histories Project. He did so again using for the Battle of Springfield some base maps that already existed, but for the Battle of Hartville, God bless him, worked with the sketch maps that John and I gave him, drawing in little things, and he had to interpret that. So we benefited really, really greatly from that. We were just delighted beyond words to find that we had a press and an editor that would see and ask us suggestions, what we thought was important. One of the first things I said was, make the print big enough to read. And I got an email yesterday from a friend. He said, I just got your book, haven't read it yet, but thank you for making the print big enough for me to read. He's ancient. He's 70. I'm only 68. He's an old man. But when you're trying to decide which book is worth your $40, this one on the shelf or that one, that makes a difference. And we also, John and I, are deeply appreciative of the fact that this book uses footnotes, which we and Civil War scholars have always argued did not turn off students of the Civil War. If you're writing about the lumber industry in Minnesota, which there may be great history there, great environmental history and something, then it may not necessarily be as significant. But not only will Civil War students not be turned off by them, but will be generally interested. And I think it's important. I was stuck waiting at someplace the other day and had a copy of a friend's book, and it's all endnotes. And I did something I hadn't done. I'd read her book 2 years before, but now I sat down and started reading her endnotes. So if they're footnotes and you're a scholar, you read them. If they're endnotes, you don't get an appreciation of another scholar's work if you don't read their reference notes. And if they are endnotes, it is so easy, because particularly if you're hurried, you have lots of other things to do and test to grade. You may intend to thoroughly look at the sources your friend or colleague or the stranger used, but don't end up doing so. So we think that's one reason this is a great piece of work. And also, we argued, and we're delighted to have ears that listen, that color maps are a way to attract buyers. It may put the cost of the book up, but again, why do you buy this book rather than that book? And we've had friends and colleagues say, such great maps, and color maps are just almost, you just don't find them anymore these days on books that aren't, coffee table books. Not putting down coffee table books, but they're a different marketing strategy. And that's pretty much what I had to say about writing the book. I would be happy to take questions on anything. And again, I just wish you, I know John would think of things that I didn't think of. But know he would also be here if he could. Jim.
You gave us praise, and so allow me to return the favor. First of all, every time I hear you talk about the book, you rewrite it. You say things that you didn't say in the book, and it leads me to wonder, how many more times can you rewrite it? For example, you had mentioned that this was a puzzlement. You had a man who was a mayor defeating a West Point grad. Boy, I
We did not end up expressing it that way. And by the way, and I have to tell you, you've written a lot of books. Every book after you've written it, you find the way you should have written it.
Oh, I know.
If you don't, your friends will tell you,
Right.
and they'll be quick to tell you. So the answer is, I mean, you probably noticed that yes, you get involved in things, and after it's over, you think of ways that you should have done it. And to pose that question as a teaser,
Yeah.
somewhere on the cover,
Yeah.
as early in the book, that would have been a good idea. You're absolutely right. And I have, and so when did you think of it that way? Well, after we finished sending it to you, but I honestly don't remember. It
Yeah.
just came to me one day, this is a book where a mayor of Toledo, Ohio defeated John S. Marmaduke, a West Point graduate. And that just came to me at some point, and not soon enough to put it into the book.
Well, one observation though I'd like to make is that this book is really readable, and it reads like a story. And that to me is the mark of any good piece of history, that you feel like you are reading something that could be a novel, and it has all the qualities of that reinvention of a world that you get situated in. And for me, the strength of that book is the clarity and the engagement of the narrative.
That reminds me of one other challenge I might mention. If you're studying the Civil War, because the South was defeated and because the South never had a decent mail service, and on the Union side, Union soldiers could send letters home for free through the US Post Office. For every one juicy anecdote about the Southern side, the Confederate side, that has somehow survived and somebody's letter is in the archives, you'll have 5 or more for the Union side. And if you put all 5 of those in, and the one Confederate one, it will look like you are only telling the story of one side or are biased. So there's always the got to leave this out. You can't have this many so trying to achieve some sense of balance in the way you have told the story is difficult. And then you can have something like, well, all the stuff that Rick Hatcher and I left out of our book from Wilson's Creek, all these wonderful Union side anecdotes. Well, Jeff Patrick used them all when he wrote it. So they didn't go to, of course, he found them on his own, but there is that challenge that you have to try and write in a way that people feel you're not privileging one side or another. Victor?
Bill, I'm wondering, since it hasn't been all that long, whether you were able to track down descendants of some of the people that were in the battle and see if they had anecdotes or letters or diaries that they've been holding on.
Not independently of what had been done by archives. So no, we did not. I did that when I was doing a biography of James Longstreet, Confederate general. I did do that, as you might expect would be kind of standard when writing a biography, to see for descendants. But we did not do that for this project. And had we done so, maybe we'd have found something very great coming out. But for better or
Nothing
worse,
else, be sure to advertise in Toledo.
yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Was there anything that you discovered that was totally unexpected? I mean, the most surprising aspect of the compare?
Something coming completely out of left field, something, no, there was not something on that level that completely surprised us in terms of how the operation went, and the whys and wherefores. We didn't find any major surprises. Details, yes, and constant surprises of, here's a Union source and a Confederate source talking about the same thing, and you read them both as if they weren't even on the same planet. Shelby says they charge 2 times, and the people who received the charges said they charge us 3. So there are always things like that that are surprises, and that you aren't expecting those, but you have to try and reconcile those, but they don't end up changing, of course, the narrative or the big picture. So no, for this particular project, I did not. Some other projects I've worked on, yes, but for this one, no. And I don't recall John finding anything that reached that category, but of course I can't swear. He might have a very interesting anecdote in response to that. So other Greg and
Philip, just wondering, having read your book on Wilson's Creek, one of the student in your class a while ago, how would you compare the experience of writing that book versus this book? I remember talking about, your Wilson's Creek book, you benefit from walking the ground, the battlefield's in decent shape, whereas, battlefield here is covered. I mean, was there a difficulty not only with imagining the battle, and then you mentioned
you're talking about, instead of one of the best preserved battlefields in the nation, the Wilson's Creek National Battlefield, John and I are writing about battles that took place downtown Hartville, downtown Springfield. And yes, that is really a difference. Even places that are, not everything has been preserved, and there's buildings in the way and monuments like Gettysburg and Antietam and other places. There's still big areas where you can get a sense. And so basically I've been spoiled by Pea Ridge and Wilson's Creek in a really pristine condition. And yeah, it's a challenge. And there are certainly places where, I feel I just don't know it as well as I might Wilson's Creek, simply because you can only imagine so much what something looks like without the buildings in the way. At Hartville, John and I particularly struggled. I don't know if you've been to downtown Hartville, but there's not a lot to downtown Hartville. And part of the challenge was trying to determine how much of downtown Hartville existed in 1863, and to find, fortunately, a couple of people afterwards mentioned some markers. This took place, as a post-war account, this took place where the schoolhouse now is. Thank you. Somebody has said something we can check. And using that and a couple of other things as markers, that did bring forward where we thought the battle took place. This is didn't change the same thing, but the battle took place the first time John and I visited there. We were just talking about writing the book. Here's Hartville. I hadn't been there in years, so we go to Hartville and look at things, and we know, okay, they came down this slope and they charged up this way. But those we really did revise where we thought things were initially in some of the sketch maps. And working on some of these, I had the Union forces twice as far away as we ended up thinking they were, based on other things, such as they talk about, well, we fired at long range. We have to guess what that is, but there are differences like that. And there again, but the solution was we walked the field. And fortunately, there was enough with those references and enough couple of streets where you can get a clear view of the courthouse, which would center you, because that was the one thing people mentioned. But yes, it's a challenge, and I am not as confident of the maps that we did for this book as I am for the maps in Wilson's Creek for the tour guide book that Rick Hatcher and I did later in partnership with Earl Hess and Bill Shea. And those maps I labored over, and I walked the field at Wilson's Creek again and again, and I was really put a lot of work into documenting. This is really right where they were. We couldn't do that with Hartville and Springfield. Kathleen.
I think you answered a little bit of my questions, but now that I have you here 12 years after I retired, I want revenge. I'm going to ask you the same question you asked me at my job interview.
Okay.
In part because I told my graduate students, you asked me this question, and they were really intrigued by it, and they asked me what the answer was. And I wasn't sure I knew any better than I did 12 years ago. And the question you asked me was, at what point does a historian, or do you think you have enough evidence to draw, you asked everybody that question.
I did a lot, yeah.
Conclusion, and you started to talk about it, but my graduate students really want to know the answer. So they want to know, is it 5, 6, I'm not kidding. But you might talk a little bit about, you talked about the decisions on the maps, but at what point do we move it from where we can kind of confidently say,
Yeah, well, and as you know, some of my guests, for those historians who specialize in statistics, they think we're all just writing anecdotes and have nothing to back what we do. For people who put their careers, and wonderful good people, I'm not putting them down, but who put their careers in working with things where they have massive amounts of data, they think we today, going back, whether you're studying the Civil War on back to ancient history, biblical history, as Victor does, they think we are all making outrageous conclusions based on too little evidence. And the best answer to that big question is one of the distinguished professors of the Civil War, James McPherson, said in answer to that is, well, we can throw up our hands and not do anything, or we can make the best of what we've got, which is a lot of fun. And so we work with what we have. And the answer to that is, the only way you can give any kind of an intelligent answer to that is to immerse yourself in the material, as we did in Civil War stuff, as you do with gender history and other things, to really know what's out there and know whether or not there are other things you could find or likely to find to make those decisions. And then, today's is so relevant, the mark of a historian is when you say, I can draw no conclusion. There is not enough evidence on this particular issue to reach a conclusion. Leaving out politics, just the internet, just all kinds of people presenting evidence, quote unquote, for all kinds of things. But again, and often for very well-meaning non-professionals who are writing history, well-meaning, but they will often, because they like the subject and want to, they will not do that. They will use evidence very sparsely. And so what is enough in one case, in one thing for Civil War and something, it's going to be different. I hope I've done a really good job of avoiding answering your question. Yeah, well, it's appropriate to torture me back. That's quite appropriate. And I'll finally give you another honest answer. The further you get away from what you've done, the more you're aware that it would have been nice to have had more information before you reach that conclusion. So in writing the first book I did based on my dissertation on James Longstreet, I'm completely confident in the book and all its overall conclusions, but some of the wording, I might have phrased it less directly and said, it is most likely that the best evidence is that I would have used phrasing that acknowledged in some places that I was drawing conclusions based on less evidence than was like. Some other places, boom, here's the letters that prove what you want, black and so. But that's the best answer I can give, and to say that when you're in the middle of a project, it's very easy to be caught up in it, and then later you go, I would have liked to have more information. So I can't put a number on it, nor could you. Yeah.
We have a comment from Jim Coombs.
Yes.
I want to read to everyone. So we have everyone say hi to Jim. He's joining us virtually.
Hi, Jim.
And he says, I'd just like to say that I really appreciated that Bill and John began the book with the events in Kansas and Missouri to put into context the events that led up to Marmaduke's raids. So,
Well, thank you, Jim.
Yes, thank you, Jim.
I hope you were with us in time where you heard me express how much John and I are indebted to you for your fine work on the maps and how they add just tremendously to the project. But of course, one of the elements of studying the Civil War in Missouri is that you see those pre-war and post-war connections with a clarity you don't necessarily get elsewhere unless you are talking about race. And that, of course, is the controversies in Kansas and the spillover of the lawlessness after the Civil War. So that certainly makes it a very interesting study. Any other questions?
I have one, and I know you start off by saying you didn't want to discuss the actual subject of the book, but
Well, not,
yeah.
happy to now.
With this current pandemic, among many things that it's brought to light is the fragility of supply chains. And so I'm not a historian by any stretch of military campaigns, but I've heard enough historians say how important supply chains are to anything that you try to do militarily.
Yeah.
In the context of Marmaduke's raid into Missouri, how did that work as a supply challenge? And it was January, so what I would generally characterize as foraging and seizing livestock and things like that probably was a little bit more difficult in January than other months of the year. Was that a major factor in the overall outcomes of this raid?
It was, and you see it in two places, one negatively and one positively, at the Battle of Hartville. One of the things, it's what military would call an encounter battle, is two forces meet each other unexpectedly. Basically, the men fighting at Hartville were on their way to try and get to Springfield because they'd heard there'd been a battle there. And so, but one of their concerns, major concern for the battle, was a supply train that they had. And basically, they took up a stand and fought so that they could get that supply train to safety. And to do so, they did something that I'd never heard of. They moved cross country, basically cut a road to get over a difficult bit of terrain. And again, another one, when John and I are looking at, they had to have moved here. God, it's a steep gully. How much could it have changed? So you have that, the whole thing ties into trying to get that supply train. So it drives the battle. For Marmaduke's raid, more largely though, and we did mention this, and I mean, this is something I have always felt strongly about. We mention how much food soldiers eat and how much their horses eat, and admit that neither here nor in almost any other Civil War records do you get the detail, but that there's only so much food the raiders could have carried on their horses. And unlike a few other raids, they didn't take any mule pack trains with them, like Custer did at Bighorn. So there's only so much weight a horse can carry. So by the time they get up to Springfield, they have to have acquired food en route. You can't sustain horses by grazing. And we know from where they went through, they encountered almost no horses they could requisition, which is, of course, military for steel. So we know they have to have been feeding the horses someplace. You can make the poor men go without food for a significant amount of time. We also know that by the time they were going home, the horses were in terrible shape. And about 200 of Marmaduke's men were on foot for the last little part of it. So we know they worked the horses to death, and you find all kinds of evidence that in the campaign. We also know they could not have gone the days they did, and the horses are dying here. They'd have died up there if they hadn't been feeding them. And there are no records of that. You will only find those records when you get the person who got messed up, short end of the stick from the military and had their food taken, and they go register a complaint, and the complaint has survived. And you find some of those in Provost Marshall's records on the Union side, very hard to find on the Confederate side. That is something that gets little attention because the evidence is hard to find. There's an incredible book by a historian named Kent Masterson Brown called Retreat from Gettysburg. And he studies in detail and finds stuff all about Robert E. Lee goes up to Pennsylvania, cuts himself free from his supplies and comes back down, and goes into tremendous detail on the logistics and demonstrates with crystal clarity that 50% of the time, what Lee is thinking about and doing is finding food. Yeah. Only 50% is he military. Fully 50. Now, part of this is because Civil War staffs were woefully small and inadequate. They did not have, they had quartermasters, they had commissary officers, but they did not remotely have enough people to make this work. So the top generals spent too much time doing this. But again, demonstrating with incredible documentation what we've always known, the tremendous amount of time that goes into this, which gets left out of books because it's boring to read. And I can't say his was the most entertaining book I ever read, in the sense that, you know, it's not like reading about Pickett's Charge, but it is truly a masterful work and incredibly important work. And the sort of saying, if I were, again, teaching a class of graduate students and had someone who was interested in military history at all, for whatever era, I'd say, you are going to read this book. You're going to find out just how much logistics drives every day of a soldier's life. So
And I can-
long-winded answer, but you knew we were going to get one.
And I can point to Caesar's Annals.
Yes.
And also even ancient Assyrian records that tell you the same story.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Interpretive dances? If not, I was remiss by not mentioning at the top, but we do have opportunities to acquire. We have both a soft cover and a hardcover edition of the book. By giving a donation to the Ozark Studies Institute at various levels, and we have a nice graph back there. If I could read them through my bifocals, I'd tell you, but it's $30 gets you a signed soft cover copy of the book. $40 for a $40 donation, you'll get a signed hardcover copy. And for $50, you will get a signed copy, I think it's the hardcover, plus an annual subscription to Ozarks Watch magazine. So if you are so inclined to support the work of the Ozark Studies Institute and find publications like we gave them Thunder, please consider that. And we do have refreshments as well, so feel free to refresh. And it's all about logistics and supply chain. So the T train did make it here.
Can I mention something else? And in a sense, this has already been noted. And you mentioned it earlier when you were talking about the Ozarks Studies Institute and some of the ways that the Trans-Mississippi aspect of the Civil War is understudied. I think everybody in this room knows that the same thing can be said about the Ozarks in general.
Mhm.
And that whether or not you want to say that we are sitting on a historical, cultural silver mine or copper mine or whatever precious metal you want to put us on, there is stuff in the ground that has not been dug up.
There are Yoakum dollars down there. I just.
And we.
Even I know what a Yoakum dollar is, even I do.
And we owe it to
Yeah,
the
well-
region to be the individuals who dig it.
Talking about fighting words, I was talking to a colleague recently, last month or so, who, as I like to say, smarter than the average bear about Upland South history. And he made the statement that he considers Appalachian studies to be 40 years ahead of Ozark studies. I did not, I duly noted that mentally. I did not challenge him on that statement, but you know, that's part of, I think, supports your observation is there's a lot of work to be done about Ozarks history and culture. And that's really one of the things we're trying to do with the Ozark Studies Institute, is really, if it's about the Ozarks in some way, Route 66, Ozark Jubilee, Civil War, it doesn't matter, in-migration, out-migration, agriculture. Brooks Blevins, I think, has really opened my eyes anyway to the amazing agricultural history of this region. Tomato canneries, it's an amazing region that deserves more attention, I think, from
Let me,
historians.
and let me throw out a point, and I hope this won't be too controversial, but much of the publications on the shelves, popular publications on the Ozarks, are written by what I would call serious amateur historians, and what they are writing are chronicles. They're not writing history in the same way that we're talking about it here. And I'd like to see more history and less chronicle produced with respect to the Ozarks. Not to disrespect my chronicling colleagues,
Yeah.
but to say that there's a difference.
There are a lot of memoirs of growing up in the Ozarks written by white males. And I've read quite a few of them. And we need more diverse kind of studies. Nothing wrong with those, but we need more diversity and breadth in the studies of this region.
I would suggest also ethnic studies.
Yes,
There's quite a difference in culture from one area to another.
yes.
I will say, Mr. Sanders, the last 30 years has seen tremendous advance of Civil War scholarship on the Trans-Mississippi. If you go back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, there's very little, but in the last 30 years, a lot of good work has come out. So it's still not the amount of material you have compared to other places, but it's no longer quite as neglected.
Since you mentioned mining, that's a big industry in this area too, that has not been touched adequately.
Yes, whenever somebody asks me why did Missouri matter, Granby lead mines,
There you go.
which produced somewhere I don't remember, I have it written down someplace. The amount annually that came out of the ground was staggering,
Mhm.
just way beyond anything I would have imagined. So.
Well, thanks everybody for coming, and feel free to mingle. And if you are so inclined to give a donation and receive some goods and services in return, you can, tax time is coming. So do feel free to have some more refreshments. Thanks again.